we take the roll.
Alderman Hoffer.
Here.
Alderman Nelson is not here. Alderman Hanneman.
Here.
Got Member Cheehee.
Here.
Member Howard.
Here.
Member Schmidt is not here. You do have a quorum.
Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next order of business is the citizens' comment period. He's busy with their turkeys. I guess they're not here tonight. I'll go ahead and close the citizens' comment period, and we'll move on to item number 3, which is approval of the meeting minutes for Finance Committee dated October 26, 2021, which are attached and included in the packets.
I move approval of the minutes.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Approval of the minutes for October 26, 2021. Any further discussion? Hearing, seeing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Beyond item 4, I think a recap of the bonds. And
So included in your packet were the day sale reports for both issues. If we could talk about the early November one, which is the $2 million used to fund the early November one, which is the $2 million used to fund the capital projects for the city. I would call this a very successful sale. We got a rate of 1.27% on a 9-year note, and relatively we have a 9-year note, and relatively we had a number of bidders, which is good. There's a copy of the Moody's rating. The Moody's again affirmed our AA2 rating, which is a positive. But I would remind the committee last talked about the Moody's rating that we are probably closer to AA3 than we are to AA1. And so depending on how finances move into the future, that could be a situation. But Moody's continues to believe that the city is in sound financial condition. And any questions about that first loan?
It's a really good rate.
It is a good rate. For us as a payer, not so much for those who might be investing in hiring. The other note sale, the council decided to go forward with both the sewer fund, which we knew we had to do, and then as well as the offering was for $6.5 million. There were a couple of bidders on that, but in either case, I think there were 4 bidders on that with a very, very narrow range, and the city was able to snag a 1.87% rate on very, very narrow range, and the city was able to snag a 1.87% rate on that loan. So that was, again, very positive for the city. It's a little longer term loan, and there's a little capitalized interest on it. Same Moody's investor rating was attached to that. But again, if you had questions, I'd be happy to talk about that. Alderman Hammond?
And this is a question that didn't come up, excuse me, at council meeting the other night, but is it free or normal that the same bidder would be the winning bidder for both offerings?
The best answer I can give you on that is there really are only maybe 10 or fewer bidders for this debt that's out there. General bidders like certain names better than others, and so Northland has won several of the more recent debt offerings of the city. So I wasn't surprised that they came in favorable and at the best rate. FHN Financial is new bidder for us, or Piper Sandler has bid a couple of times. Trying to think of who the other bidders were. Bach Financial has won the award a couple times. Bernandi was a new bidder on our debt. You saw Baird was on both.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't And I think sometimes when somebody likes a name, they'll be a little more aggressive in what they bid for us, bid on it, so they end up getting the security.
Okay.
Part of it might be also Northland Securities and what their customers. These are smaller debt limits, so you're not going to attract the big people or whatever. It's retail, whatever, and they may have customers that know the name and say, hey, I like a solid A2, get this rapid.
Okay.
And keep in mind that when we sell debt, we are essentially selling fixed rate debt. So while the debt market's at the debt sale report, the back page shows what's going on with interest. Those are the interest rates that end up secondary buyers end up getting on the debt. But when we sell it, we fix our debt for the whole term of the debt. So our debt costs are for the whole term of the debt. So our debt costs are fixed when we sell, and if our rating improves or degrades, that impacts the secondary market and only the new issues that we have. It doesn't impact the old issues, except to the secondary buyers. Only the new issues that we have. It doesn't impact the old issues, except to the secondary buyers.
When they said in the report that one of the ways to improve the rating is to increase the revenue through taxes and whatnot. So how much does that need to increase to really impact that? Because we're looking at a potential of around 100 million coming in of new development. But then there's going to be additional cost with those through the TIDs and whatnot as well. So I guess how much do you really need to make up to move that?
I would say a lot. If you would read the Moody's report, generally speaking, they don't like Wisconsin issuers because of the levy limits. The state caps what local government can do, and so our primary revenue source is capped. And with Frank taxing to that cap, that's viewed negatively for us by them. We have the ability to raise our levy by a considerable amount because we don't claim all of our debt service costs. And we could raise our levy a whole lot more, but we choose not to tax our residents. Moody's, I think, would like to see more revenue coming in here, but that would mean tax increases, and that's usually not desirable.
Otherwise, curtail the borrowing.
Or curtail borrowing, but as we are a growing community and we have a fair amount of development occurring, and that development is requiring infrastructure, that's where we spend a lot of our time. Now in TID 5, did you know it was built on a landfill? And there was a whole lot of other costs associated with that. It wasn't just streets and sewer and water. There was a considerable storm sewer cost. There was a lot of land moving around. There was $4.5 million methane space. There was light and sound that we helped the developer with. There were berms. So to get that site to a point where it needed to be to support the entertainment activity that's going on there, it took a lot of city support. Well, that adds to our debt base.
There's a lot of index. Probably closer. But nonetheless, I think it moves us to do all the power today as you develop that rating over time and it enhances accordingly. And I think buys will if you because it sets a precedent. Typically, might be whatever uncertain.
Actually, and your other comment, Alderman Hofer, is pertinent because later in our agenda we're going to talk about the capital program for the next several years. And while we haven't done the work yet to say how much of that is going to have to be debt financed, it's not unreasonable to think that there will be a significant portion of that which is debt financed. And how does that fit into your total debt picture? You know, those are the kinds of things that need to be taken into consideration. There's a lot of, I'll use the term toys, that the city may want that may not, I'm not being derogatory, but there's a lot of things on our wish list, but they cost money, and depending on what you're fired, that could impact your debt rating.
One more point in regard to your question about added value. When our new corporate park gets that needs to get off cycle, not with a bond. Bonds as they come in, re-rate. Those are typically happen. So what change growth between now and then, as long as the financial positive place, we might be good at that time. The mayor wants it all the time, but really that's that we that.
Thank you.
Any further comments on that? Hearing seeing none, we'll move on to item number 4, and that's going to be a discussion, I think, on bid 3 and our.
Yes. So I'm just going to ask you, though, to page forward to page 8 of the financial document that was included with your packet. Not that one,
Not that
Alderman, in the packet that we sent you.
Yeah, sorry, I came from another appointment.
That's fine. In that, but that's fine. In the document you're looking at, you want to look at page, because it'll be the same general data. You want to look at page 125, which is table 9 and table 10 in that book. Table 10 should look something like this. So what you've got looking at may not be in the upper right-hand corner. I'm sorry, Schedule 10. Upper right corner, there should be an indication of what schedule or table you're on. Is that a table or is that a schedule? Is that a table or is that a schedule? These are tables, so I'm going to have you pull back a little bit. Summary page. Can't believe it. I'll give you my book.
You know what, by heart?
I'm sorry. Gotcha.
I do, but this same schedule is in
Thank
our
you.
book, so that you got it. So I asked you to look at page 8 in the financials, and it's the table you're looking at, the schedule you're looking at, Alderman Hopper, and then
There we go.
focus on the TID 3. And in TID 3, you'll see there's an $865,000 accrued liability there. Does everybody see that? That is an estimate the city made in 2015 when the DOT reconstructed 27th Street as part of the project. And engineering on this memo that I gave you, $1.3 million the city was going to owe on that project. Well, the project's been done for quite some time. Recently, we received a check from the Department of Transportation saying you overpaid us $28,000 on that project. And they've audited the DOT has verbally told us that they've considered that project closed. So that $865,000 liability that's on our books, that's really not needed and come back out.
That's how we funded the retirement party. Got it.
That's on tape, so it's going to make me look bad in front of all of our residents who happen to come and listen to that. Right. So we've held this here for a long time because we felt maybe the Department of Transportation would come back and say, "Hey guys, you owe us a bunch of money." And the Department of Transportation was changed since about the same time they were doing that project, and we think they lost track of some stuff that they were supposed to bill us for. But it's now 6 years later, and they've audited it, and they say they're done. So this TID could have even more money. TID could have even more money in it because we will collect next year's increment, and if you can see what the annual increment is off of those documents, and it'll be something similar to that, while it only has $1.3 million left, or $1.4 million left in debt. So with a 3 left or $1,400,000 left in debt. So with a cash balance of $1 million, we'll call it $1,700,000, and now you're going to bring in another $2.6 million in revenue next year. That gets you to $4.2 million, and you pay off $1.3 million or $3 million or $1.4 million in debt. That'll be the excess money in that TID that can be paid out. And a quarter of that would come back to the city. The other portions would go to the other taxing authorities. So the question becomes, when do you want to deal with that? It was identify for you the fact that that's out there.
Are there consequences to dealing with that or taking those actions this year and 21, holding it over?
The only reason to hold it over would be is if because we close it and fund or right taxing.
Right.
So that's, I mean, we could keep it in reserve, but I guess what I would do is ask CLA, our new auditors. I would just ask them what their recommendation on that is. Guess is, and we've talked about it a little bit. My guess is on that is guess is, and we've talked about it a little bit. My guess is because Paul's right. It doesn't all their new record.
We did close TID 2. Now that was back in 2012. We held back a $500,000 reserve, which the city kept because there was a pile of dirt in the district that had to be moved. And Alderman Hoffer, I think you've been on the CDA, so you might recall that. Mm-hmm. And we held back that as move that dirt somewhere and dispose of it. Eventually, one of the developers said, well, we'll do it for you, but you got to give us the $500,000 to pay for it. So we dispersed it out and we were done. But if you end up with costs that come back at you after you close the TID and you've dispersed all the money, well, now the city's on. If you got it in the TID, then you only get your share of the TID. So, but this is getting quite old, and arguments can be made both ways on it.
Well, one thing that you and I talked about was exactly
right.
So that's out there too. So
right.
So that's out there too. So perhaps well, right? Because when you first do the first DOT agreement, spell out who's going to pay for what. Then they go into final design and start to change, added, subtracted. Sometimes the DOT takes on more just because they have a bit of funds. The DOT takes on more just because they have a bit of funds. That also, but we'll make sure when we talk to the auditors about it, tell them the story. And I mean, if the committee tonight wants to make a recommendation, we can certainly take that. But I guess I'd feel more comfortable holding
certainty that state DOT audit of the project complete.
But again, I want to emphasize that that was a verbal communication from one staff member at the DOT to a staff member here. They did this, all they did was send us a check with it. So, I mean, we could not as a city say, well, you told us it was done, because they're going to say, no, we didn't.
So that might be something the auditors suggest, hey, get
exactly.
And we can certainly pursue that. I'm not sure, I didn't look at the check, I'm sure we still have a copy of it, but what I'd like to see is what it said. Did it say, what I'd like to see is what it said. Did it say close out of this project, there's a DOT project, like that. If it said close out, but that's what the auditor. So, and we also have auditors for the closure, you have to do a TID audit, a full audit within 180 days closure. We also do an audit going, a full audit within 180 days closure. We also do an audit going. They just not commit either way. Mm-hmm. That audit is another confirmation, if you will, that we're so.
Does this show up anywhere else? Financial statement? Assuming the person.
Right. I mean, it's part of our financials. That's an accrual that's sitting a liability on, on our full accrual statement. Well, but other than that, nothing unusual about it.
I'm assuming the other side of that is some kind of a capital.
Right.
You just reverse that expenditure. It's going to look funny. You just reverse that expenditure. It's going to look funny.
Right. Well, especially when you're, well, on our books, it's down, not status. But I mean, something happening 7 years after it's done, it's like, unique, I guess. Odd. But a check for 26,000 is a check for 26,000. Any further thoughts on this? I mean, I think that all makes sense, obviously. Larson, he can be on board. And I mean, it all fits together. Close it one way or the other. Ample cash.
Right. And then it's just a question of you hold the money back, and and then a few years later you could distribute it out.
How long would you hold on to it at that point? That's
I don't know, because at this point already we've held it from 2015 to now 6 years. It'll be 7 years. How much longer do you want to hold it?
at that point, can you hold it for interest?
Yeah, we could put it in interest bearing account. One, you're not getting any interest on earnings right now.
It almost seems from a record keeping standpoint, TIDs are designed to run their course and then get rolled over. Larson, if this probably, it'll be interesting to see if they've had experiences with other communities, or if this is a pattern, or if it's this particular, or to us, or this particular project, and they may have some guidance on that as well. But where I was going with that comment is typically once it's done and developed, they roll these over and get them off, and tax coming back to the city. So and move on with it. There'll be new ones replacing it. But anyway, well, thank you for that. No other discussion. We'll move on. We have item 6, 5-year capital plan.
Just put that on the agenda to kind of give you a heads up. We've been doing a lot of talking internally. So when we talked about the 2022 through 2026 capital plan earlier, I think it was August meeting, we talked about just focusing on 2022 and then perhaps focusing on the 4 out years after the new year. We have been doing some discussion with the mayor, and I've made a recommendation to him that we actually create a capital improvement committee. We have a lot of big things coming up in the near future, potential things. I would say we saw the capital request list that was over 107 million, but in addition to that, some updated numbers. So there's a lot of analysis I think that needs to be for a number of reasons. I just recommended a capital improvement committee to him. What that would do is that would relieve the finance committee of worrying about the nature of the projects and allow the financing plan, the availability of resources, the debt limits, internal debt limit, as well as our full debt capacity, perhaps changing some of our debt strategy, revenue debt going. So really just a little bit of an update. I was going to kind of give you some information to get you thinking about things for the January meeting, but as this came up and we've been talking over the last few weeks, I just set up a draft committee with a purpose, and I had at a different scenarios that created like an evaluation format for how do we evaluate what capital programs were, what's the effect of the program on the city's goals, the interrelationship with that capital project and other ones. How about the plan? What about efficiency, right? If we can do a capital project, that's going to get us some efficiency, have to be maintenance. So there's a lot of things that we talked about. and both the mayor and I kind of felt like it would be unfair to burden this. The nature of the permit so far would be he wants to consider it a little bit more, or he'll be ready to take action. Would that be asking to create the capital committee, and then basically the capital committee would work till let's just February till June, and what I asked him for is at least days at the finance talk about the tandem while the capital committee is going on. But I think that having this done in the operating budget process would do us all, give this the due it needs, the it needs versus process of the operating. The past, just to give you a little insight, the mayor has basically gotten all the list of projects from the bus. It basically goes down the list and says yes, no, that kind of thing. And he joked with me about I must not like the way he does that, and it's not that at all. It's just that something bigger issue. And it's not that at all. It's just that something bigger issue. That too. So if this committee is okay with that suggestion and financing piece of it, that's how we would plan.
Well, I think there's some projects that are out in front of us that are significant. You mentioned in front of us that are significant. You mentioned fire. So those at some point have to be together with the rest of the budget plan, all of them not of that size or significant. Some of them might be able to budget surplus or whatever. Some of them talking dollars. Probably quite like the more legwork should have the business covered, and it's going to affect operations service for residents for quite some time. So all thought out, monitoring. How do you support it going forward? Well, with our labor costs, etc. So, especially with that size, that's a lot of stuff. Yes.
How do you see this? City being up? What?
So we've had some discussions on that. I've done a lot of these in the community. Usually, any capital by the mayor for the very sure it starts out usually budget. Of course, someone in my position involved, the finance involved, and then the finance involved, and then the other get at least 7. Usually, somebody that well in tune with what works are some couple council members. I think citizen members are important because there's an element that we sometimes need or what we having some citizen stakeholders would, I think, it out. But now, I get that the mayor's one of his comments was we didn't want it to get big, and I think it's valid. And director, 2 council members.
Something that sort of sits in the back of my mind is we have a lot of capital improvement projects on the horizon for the municipality. Improvement projects on its horizon sooner than later. And I think that previous councils and mayors have always been very diligent in trying to separate the two. But when the average citizen gets their tax bill, they don't necessarily always look at, oh, well, that's the school, that's not the city. It's Franklin. And I would love to see some, I don't know, communication, cooperation between the two so that we as a municipality know projects. Because there could be years down the road that this city, and yes, they're going to have to go to a referendum for their capital improvement projects. But there could be some big slams down the road.
The way we build taxes in Wisconsin, well, we love the 7 tax increases and 4 decreases. So it just kind of depends on the year, but you're right. If at least with our local partners, the MATC has a little harder,
Right.
as well as MMSD, but with our local partners, and I will tell you, the mayor and I have strict periodically, periodically project, the school district, even Norway School, the city of Waukesha. So I think those conversations are. You're right, because when our citizens get it all came on one bill,
And there could conceivably be a year where, the city is building this big fire station and we're building another new elementary school. Where are we getting all this money? We're spend. And that's going to be how people absorb and understand.
Well, the other side of that coin is, if you have several large projects occurring, they tend to demand cash flow for 20 years. So even if one does it in year 1 and another one does it in year 7, you have a significant overlay of those cash. So to be aware of what is going on in the other district,
Right.
the other authorities' environment, what's going on in their sandbox is helpful in terms of how you're managing the total city.
But I think your comment is well taken in that all of this, all of this has to keep citizens. And if you see the city expanding, population growth and whatever, there's a need that comes along with that. Fire protection, schools. So that all has to come into a kind of the teaching or learning of that, if you will. Numbers you talked about, yeah, that's when the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
But if you're doing these kind of disjointed and all of a sudden isn't coming, but I think talked about that. That's Jim. I think welcome serving the same customer and to do that the best way, even with the disturbance of some of the construction activity, not to coordinate that to say, oh, we're going to block off, detours on 4 streets at, for all summer, and like, what are you doing? So yeah. What are you doing? So yeah.
not to cancel. We also have to water, but would be
Is planning in that committee in particular, I like to have like some milestones incorporated into there. I know in years past when Jack Bennett was here, he could tell you how many man per road mile, truck, et cetera, and there are other indicators that different departments may look at to say, okay, if we get so many subdivisions with this additional road, it's 2 more guys for water department, that's 3 street people, we got 4 new parks, we need more mowing, something so that makes it easier for the community to understand parameters, these goalposts, and then you can also compare them to like neighboring communities to say, here's where we stand. You know what I mean? So it's not, so you have some basis for making the argument. And then the other comments that I would make is, or a question I would have, is that committee then using what's on that wish list, and there would seem to the need for some longer term continuity, because mayors and aldermen are subject to terms and the will of the voters, and you may have one mayor that's no, 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 and the next one may come in and want to say yes to all. Or how do we determine through the growth what increases may be and communicate that to the public, and then have that established so that the council and the mayor have a basis for the priorities. I mean, when I was in commercial construction, just what happened, you meet with all of the department heads and they have their wish list, and then the CEO would go, no, no, no. Doesn't quite exactly work that way with government, but we need some kind of checks and balances to do that. That wasn't as coherent as I wanted to make it.
No, that was perfectly clear, actually.
Yeah.
That's exactly, and that's.
I wanted to make it.
No, that was perfectly clear, actually.
Yeah.
That's exactly, and that's the conversation that the mayor and I had, because he said, why don't you? And I said, no, certainly not that, but when we have a 5-year plan and we have all of it in front of us, we've now documented a lot of our, not all of them, but we've documented a lot of them. So the question just becomes, what does our action, not all of them, but we've documented a lot of them. So the question just becomes, what does our action, talking about 10 million different. So I think the committee would do just by its nature what you said about maybe just thought process, maybe part of this whole thing, planning process, a lot of involvement, start talking about what we're right now. The mantra is a little bit of everything sounds like a good idea until should have bucks and not raise our taxes. That was important, and that's as long as you can do it successfully, that's a great plan. But in a growing, I heard 2 of you at least say it, if not all 3 of you. It comes to a point where these capital projects. That's put our arms. What service can the city provide? That's it's going to be a byproduct that comes up with this for sure, and I think it's going to be bigger than just the committee. There, I can sometimes where this committee may be presenting items to the whole. We're going to need consensus among a couple of different levels.
Well, deferred maintenance or replacement. And when somebody's sitting looking at just the dollars saying, no, we can't afford that right now, what's the real cost?
And you don't have any snowplows that are working when you have 2 feet of snow.
Well, I think that back to your mayor elected position, 2 council, probably 3 of 7 would be maximum turnover. The nice part about council is that typically all 6 of them don't change over at once. And I think on some of these, I think filtered through this committee is the council members. I don't know, I want to super eyes and ears or whatever. You have to carry that message a little bit back to your counterparts. Same thing could happen here, where if there is a change or whatever, you have hopefully council members that are maybe not as intricate or detailed as maybe those committee members were, but as intricate or detailed as maybe those committee members were, but if they were asked to join, they could, step in, get up to speed relatively quick, even though they may have not been tracked. Gotta keep that going. Gotta keep that going. Talking about, I think that is a important piece of it, especially when you're talking projects that have longevity. Excellent commentary. Anything further?
No, like I said, I think as this goes forward, there will be certainly some finance. There might be some recommendations. Conversations on how much should we be spending on average capital. Spending on average capital. What does that look like right now? Our borrowing policy is borrowing dollars every year. That looks like when we start looking at bigger projects. We have not, Paul and I have talked about it, but we haven't done it, but overlaying that draft capital plan on our debt schedule, right, it would, right, it would be viable at that point. So we obviously know we can't do everything, but I think a lot of affordability. So the capital committee talks about the nature of the projects and the priorities. This committee then is the conduit to get it to. I think taking that decision out of this.
Very good. Let's move on then and look at financial results for 10 months.
I mean, financials are kind of stodgy. We just keep doing what we've been doing time and time again. So there's nothing unusual going on. On page 2, you see the graph of what's going on with landfill siting. My comment on that, we continue to be on a target of about $2.5 million in revenue. We originally planned for $2.1 million, so there's an extra $400,000. Finance is splitting that between equipment replacement and the street improvement, which are the two funds that have maybe the greatest underfunding and greatest need. So that continues to happen. Cash position is listed on page 5. We just aren't getting any returns on, money that's 4 months or 4 years or less in duration. So we continue to be pushing it over to American Deposit Management. We could do more with CDs there, but I think in this trend period, we're going to be looking at primarily just money market returns, which are pretty dismal in the grand scheme of things. We added the TID debt to the TID schedule. If I was really good, I probably would also add the outstanding debt to the debt service. The outstanding debt was. I thought of that myself this morning. I'm going, well, I added it to the TIDs. Why didn't I add it here? I just didn't. Maybe I'll make that suggestion to the accounting manager. Because once you get it there, it's not hard to maintain it. The only other place I would direct your attention to is the final 2 pages. Self-insurance fund. We had planned to be very small deficit for the year. Right now we're running a small surplus, on $3 million in proposed annual costs. We had planned a $55,000, looking at $165,000 surplus through 10 months. So that's I think in reasonable position and performing the way we might have thought it would, because they're pretty good sized numbers and those are pretty small. On the post-employment plan, we have another issue where we're going to talk about that, and for the current year, you see that we have a small surplus from insurance results on that. You would typically expect to see a deficit there because these are the older people. You would expect that they would be consuming more healthcare rather than less healthcare. But for 2 years now, we've run relatively small insurance surpluses, and it's just been a bang-up year for the investment results. Last year at this time, we were showing a very small loss on our investments, and we've got almost a $1.1 million gain on the investments, just because that's what the markets are doing, and this is passively invested. So if you had questions on the financials, I'd take them, but if not, I don't think we need to spend a tremendous amount of time on them.
Just one quick comment. I look at page 6, and that says we're 2 months away. What is the crystal ball like? We are. It seems like we're going to have some labor that will be under expenditures because of timing. That will probably just be timing. That will probably continue to benefit us.
Yes.
So I guess maybe playing a little bit devil's advocate. Where do we really think?
Well, when we put the budget plan together, we do take a hard look at where we think we're going to be, and that was last done in July. I haven't done much with that since then. And in July, we projected a surplus of about $350,000. And that was anticipating a $300,000 transfer from the general fund to, there's a budget here of 361, an amended budget. We think we'll use probably 300,000 of that. And that would leave about a $350,000 surplus, I believe. Best guesstimate right now. Better than we thought. Expenditures, we've had some vacancies, and those will hang with us. They're filled positions now, but early in the year they were vacancies, and so we funded it, but we didn't fill them.
And the reason I just want to talk about that is we go through the budget process, and assuming we passed the budget while I was out of town, 2022, and we had anticipated using up some fund balance. That doesn't materialize, and we add the fund balance. Taxpayers can look at this and say, well, wait a minute, telling us one thing you're going to do, telling us one thing you're going to do and something else, or why aren't you adjusting this, or so I guess I'm just kind of looking as to where we think we might be, because we had a fund balance at $9 million plus starting the year, and the $13 million showing it, but just kind of gets back to what our term where we were.
Well, if you look at that amended budget, which is showing a $3.5 million deficit, $2.5 million of that was expected contingency that we haven't used and we don't plan on using. Nothing that would cause us to. So that 3.5 becomes essentially $1 million. We do plan on using the $300,000 transfer out, which was using a portion of last year's surplus to pull it back down. So that's what that $300,000 was. And overspends in total on our operating costs. So I would guess it's going to be closer to a plus number than a negative number. But I think you're going to be pretty close to a break even for the year, having used the surplus last year. So $9 million as a fund balance at the end of the year, plus or minus 300,000. Best guesstimate.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I could attack it from that way. 2021, that we were right. 2022, we had a number of conversations between Paul and myself, and it was don't cut too much, don't reduce too much, because we don't want to have a hard landing. 2021 might be a bit of an odd year because there have been a fair amount of vacancies. 11 April hard landing. 2021 might be a bit of an odd year because there have been a fair amount of vacancies. 11 April. By August, they were all filled. So they've had a couple more then we've also had 11 April. By August, they were all filled. So they've had a couple more then we've also had a few public, and right now actually plan fill them and you're at a negative, but I would tell you that we have taken this consideration to grow. Got to do that next. But if indeed there are additional stuff, we will be having a conversation on getting that 30% alternative. But point well taken with the surplus that happens each year. I guess I'm looking at this. What this is showing me is about $1 million over. desired $1 million.
Right. If it's tied to the labor line, it's pretty, tied it together. Or, like you said, ever not, although I know that in reality that will happen. But, it's just, again, back to the capital side, I mean, it's a nice issue to have. Some fund balance to work with or play with, if you will, as you move things around. Don't have to get borrowed for whatever. But yeah, it goes back to
Present this to finance or to the common council.
50% council.
a motion and a second on the financial statements for the period ending October 2021 to be recommended to the council as presented. Further discussion? Favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Oh, okay. This one's easy.
All right, so that takes care of item number 7. 8. Naming of a temporary finance director treasurer.
We put this on the agenda because Common Council approved naming the Director of Administration the temporary finance director and treasurer of the city. Primarily, finance director and treasurer of the city. One of the reasons was that when we sign contracts, this office signs that there are appropriations to support the contract. And when the office goes vacant, the city doesn't have a backup signer vacant. The city doesn't have a backup signer for those contracts. So by naming Director of Administration as a temporary finance director, there's someone there that can then sign those documents. So we just wanted to tell you that council took that action so that you are aware of it.
Okay, that's a relation to it, or
It's until the permanent office. Just so you know, we have a candidate.
very good. Item number 9.
That you have before you is my normal memo, and I presented this a little different this time around, just to say I took this over on a passive investment basis in 2014, right after my predecessor left, and I just wanted to show you and remind you what's happened since then. And for much of the years, it just moved along on a steady growth pattern. Nothing unusual going on. And then at the end of 2019, it's like all of a sudden the world changed, because instead of a nice gradual slope, it's just taken crazy. Now, part of that was a $400,000 contribution to the plan, but the rest of it is just economic growth, so that we now show the plan having just short of $9 million in assets, which is a great place to be. The reason I presented and I point you to the page that talks about the Opeb liability, which is on page 102 of the CAFR document. It gave you a 4-year history of the Opeb liability. And the most recent year, it was showing an Opeb liability of, we'll call it 8.7 million, if everybody's following that along.
Yeah.
This morning, we received a revised actuarial report on the Opeb. I presented that to you at your place, and there's a top sheet. But before we go to this top sheet, let's look at the report. And there's a lot of stuff in here, but I point you to page 6 of the report. And there's a lot of stuff in here, but I point you to page 6 of the report, where it's giving you the current estimated liability for the Opeb trust. And the actuary now says instead of $8.7 million liability, they're saying the Opeb liability is only $7.6 million. So that's a rather significant reduction. When I spoke to him about that, he said, well, the last several years, you've not seen a whole lot. You've modified your plan design, and participants are consuming less health care. And so they think you're starting from a lower point. Now, they did put, gradual increases over time, but they think it's come down and it's only 7.6 million. Fiduciary plan assets, and I'd given them a preliminary look at the end of September showing 8.7 million in assets. It's now up to 9 million, showing we're overfunded by 1.1 million. At this point, add another 300,000 to that, and you're overfunded by 1.4 million. That impacts what you have to contribute. They're giving us what they expect is the actuarially determined contribution. For 2021, it's the year we're in, we planned on having an actuarially determined contribution of $350,000. Now they're saying for 21, our contribution only needs to be $320,000. So we actually get a further gain on the current year's projection because we don't have to contribute that 25. But then look at what they're suggesting we need for 2022. We had planned in the 2022 budget another $350,000 to 176. That's a $200,000 gain. Well, $175,000 gain. And then look at the bottom of this page. I had asked the actuaries to tell us what do they think future claims on the, and what do they expect future contributions to the plan to be. And that's why I presented you this other document, because the other document says if claims are going to be X and contributions are going to be Y, how much then needs to come? You've got to pay those claims. Well, if you aren't paying, they're going to be Y. How much then needs to come? You've got to pay those claims. Well, if you aren't paying them with contributions, you're going to pay them with plan assets. And so I said to myself, what are the monies that need to come out of the trust in future years? And then I would ask, I direct out of the trust in future years. And then I would ask, I direct your attention back to this report that I gave you and what's sitting in the bond maturity ladder. Because, and this goes back to something we've talked about, you don't want to be in a situation where the markets have gone down like they did last March, and you have to liquidate equity assets. So we purposely built this bond ladder such that you had bond money, short-term bond money, coming due that you could then liquidate back to cash to pay claims. Look at 2022, it says we're going to need $318,000. Well, our bond ladder for 2022 has $370,000 in potential maturities. Plus, you'll get some dividend income on the fund. So there's a nice matching in terms of available assets to meet required distributions coming from the plan. See how this all kind of fits together? And if our assets are now up to, trust assets are up to 9 million, we're well overfunded at this point. Now, granted, these are ranges, and if you look at the actuarial report, talk about if you had a 1% increase or a 1% decrease, how that impacts your Opeb liability. And it does swing quite a bit, so be aware of that. But this trust is in very good position, and the demand on taxpayers for current is now down to a normal service cost, and that's very manageable for us. So the action the city took in 2008 to form the trust, fund it, make up the past unfunded liability, is now going to come back and start paying spades to our taxpayers, because there's a lot of communities in the state that have this baby boom generation that are sometime retiring in the not too distant future. Does that happen? And having to pay the claims for those retirees. We've got it funded. and it's not going to be a direct demand on our current liabilities. So this sort of pulls the whole thing together, and here's our current, actuarial report. You know, I'll leave it for my successor to deal with, but I think you accept that report and you're in a really good position. Questions? And it's just because of the questions. And it's just because of the actions the city has taken, hopefully with good advice, but you've taken the right actions over the last 10, 15 years to do what's right, and you're in a good position because of it.
Dovetail on those comments, I think, offer you asked earlier about the bond rating. This second column on this report, the city contribution, this is one that they hone in on quite rapidly. Never used to be on the financial statement, right, or the accountants, right? You cover that with budget, cover that. Now, they're looking at this stuff and saying, okay, what are you doing to position? What are you assets that you have? How are you using it? Otherwise, it just gets all put right into that column.
Final part of this memo. So I would direct your attention to that. You know, moving forward, most people who are in municipal government do not know how to manage these kinds of trust assets. And I would encourage the city to hire an outside manager, even if you stay passively invested with index type funds. You really should have somebody who is comfortable managing these kinds of assets and what they're doing. And I would recommend that you hire someone. I did present at the back page history of the portfolio from 2012. We're sitting on unrealized gains of over $3 million, and this was as of the end of October. And only one time back in 2016 have we ever taken assets out of this trust to pay claims. Now, as this actuary is suggesting, that occurrence and to some significant amount, but you've got the assets there to pay them. And hopefully the portfolio is positioned to be able to deal with those requirements without having to sell equities in a down market.
What's a reasonable fee for that management service?
Something between around 1% of assets as a management fee. That's not an uncommon rate. So at $9 million, it could cost you $90,000 a year. But if you look at 2020, dividends and interest was $120,000. And you had dividends and interest was $120,000. And you had gains of another $545,000. You had $675,000 in revenues. You can afford to pay $100,000 in fees. You can afford to pay $100,000 in fees.
Keep in mind, we have not air cycle with this.
We have not.
Well,
Comment.
a little bit.
Well, within
You did for about 3-4 months, but a bear market is typically, it's not uncommon for a bear market to last more than a year. So it's one of my last opportunities to present to you, and again, it's passively invested. It's all we're doing is really watching the allocations of assets and making sure we stay on allocation, and then we do what the market does.
When did we create the trust?
Just wait.
2008.
And on the back page, you have performance from 2012 forward. That's where that schedule started, so that's why I presented it that way.
Other questions?
I will just tell you, this is on my list, this will happen in
About $9 million. And now it's maintenance. Now it's maintenance or maintaining it just as much as a challenge. Growing it. thank you for that
Mhm.
overview, Paul. It's been fun to watch. We've had a nice market to watch it in, so that adds to the enjoyment. But obviously, I think envious with it. Update on past council action.
Council did adopt the budget and it did accept the September financial report.
All right. I was out of town for the public. Is there?
I don't think there was.
The only one that talked for a long.
What's going on with the house?
Well, there's a lawsuit by those residents. The court recently remanded part of that back to the city and common. Common Council for some action.
Got to have
Another hearing of some kind. I would expect that'll occur sometime in the next 60 to 90 days, and then we'll see where we go from there.
So that's one of the. So that's one of the. It's one of the options. There's other options, other remedies that could. It's just.
Anything else we have?
Tuesday night will be your next regular scheduled.
I may or may not.
I was going to say, how does the committee feel about that?
Well, I guess in past years, probably been normally not been productive. Other potential that may challenge.
I'm not a person in the position.
No, we will have. We have a reason to have a meeting. Happy to send those to you for your reference, but we'll.
I guess what we've done is kind of left it on the schedule, leave it on there, and then nothing that's critical or earth-shattering. I can't wait until anyone shattering. I can't wait until anyone look at it.
How about if I contact you, Chair, 15? I can let you know what's going on from finance perspective.
Okay.
Does anybody know their travel plan? I think it should be at least. What's that?
Moment I am,
Over here.
but it may change.
And we do not know the status of Member Schmidt, correct? You may or may a basement member, right? Right. Member adds return.
We're currently down.
Right.
Well, Member Schmidt, and I'm not sure when his term expired. And he's expressed an interest to continue to participate once he gets his employer's approval. Well, it's taking a little longer than expected.
He was a new one though, so I don't know
Citizen
if he was
reps
a full.
often have more multi-year terms, while the aldermen are until their term is expired. What that term is.
Okay. Anything else that anybody has to add? Otherwise, I'm ready for adjournment. One thing I was going to say, and I think we kind of got into this a little bit already, is that the finance committee really serves at the pleasure of the council, or at their recommendation. If there's things that you as council men and women see, or you over there to say, hey, this doesn't make sense, or what about that, or whatever, we kind of talk about items here that we've been used to, whatever. I think capital and spending a lot of money in the future is a perfect example. But I mean, if and when those things come about, I mean, I would urge you to put your hand up and say, let's get so-and-so or the committee involved if it makes sense or reasonable to do so. A lot of things sometimes that are webbing and flowing with paper discussion, benefit, financing, after cycle, and both numbers and both out of it. But as it ebbs and flows along, so a lot of different items, and that's really the benefit of this. And I think Peggy made an outstanding comment for us elected, viewing, looking at this stuff kind of internally all day long, but the citizens sometimes look at it from 10,000 feet the other way, and that can be look very, very, very different. If there's kind of not some coordination or education or whatever, let those people know kind of what's happening. Sometimes that stuff can go off. So anyway, enough of that. Hearing nothing else, I'll take a motion a second to adjourn. Thank you again, everybody, for your participation, your